then we just don't have enough data to reach a conclusion. And as frustrating as it is, it's not like I'm saying God doesn't exist, God didn't create the universe, Jesus didn't resurrect. I'm saying I don't have sufficient evidence to do that because what we have are stories and no new data. Problem. So this is going to be fun because I just have a list of questions which I wrote down ahead of time. And even though I wasn't making any claims about God, here's the first question. Why does God need us to assess probability of the resurrection instead of just confirming it?
Yeah, so it seems like this is an appeal to a divine hiddenness. Correct me if I'm answering and
a little bit, yes.
Okay, cool. So there could be a lot of different reasons, right? For instance, God might have good reasons for keeping an epistemic distance away from us, but making things such that we do have to assess probabilities, but the likelihood ratio supports his existence, but not so much that it forces belief. So for instance, I would consider what we're doing here a really valuable thing, right? We're sitting here, and philosophers like to talk about the true, the good, and the beautiful, right? The alethic domains, the moral domains, and the aesthetic domains. Alethic is like truth value, truth-finding domains. Now, I don't know if you're a moral realist or realist about values or anything.
I don't either.
Yeah. And so, at least for me, what I'm saying is, coming from that perspective with that stuff in my background knowledge, it seems like the conjunction of God's existence in some sort of value theory would predict something like God wanting a world where we're sitting here and having these really valuable conversations. That'd be a brief overview of what I think.
So was it unfair? Because I view this thing as particularly unfair, and I've said so before. Why doesn't everybody deserve a Damascus Road experience? Why is Saul picked out to specifically get an interaction that the rest of us don't?
Is that it sounded like there was more comment to that. Sorry.
No.
Yeah, I mean,
it's the same sort of thing, because it sounded to me, and pardon me for digging in more, but it sounded to me that you're basically saying we don't really know why God does this, but he's got his reasons. Mm-hmm. And yet, according to scripture, he violates those for some people and not others. And that to me seems ridiculously unfair.
Yeah. So to be clear, I want to make sure I'm understanding your question. Is this almost like the problem of people who have like access to a miracle account? For instance, like we have, let's just say somebody in here had a religious experience or a Christophany or something like that. And your question is, why do they get it and I don't?
Yes.
Right. And again, it just seems like
I'm not expecting to have an answer, but that's the point.
Yeah. And so I feel like my answer before that still kind of addresses that.
Sure.
God might have those types of reasons. And I don't think those reasons are ad hoc. I think they're actually kind of predicted by the conjunction of those two things.
So for clarity, am I understanding correctly that we don't have extra biblical contemporary accounts that provide any confirmation of the resurrection?
Extra biblical?
Yeah.
I don't know that we need it. So,
well, that's not what I asked, though.
Well, I would say no, we don't, but I don't think we need it yet either, because I think the evidence supports what I'm arguing for on its own.
Yeah, if you don't think we need it, that's fine. I just want to make sure we're on the same page that it's not there, because when you look at somebody like the testimony of Flavianum is disputed, but also it wouldn't matter that much to me because it's not like he cites sources.
So, look, I would consider like that kind of stuff very weak evidence because it's so far removed. And somebody like Josephus is reporting something from like so far away, and these are who knows how many hand accounts, whereas the Gospels are very
decades
different.
later.
Yeah, so I'm not terribly interested in what Josephus has to say, at least on that basis, if that makes sense.
Is the intrinsic probability of Jesus' resurrection identical to any other resurrection claim?
No.
Man, I wish we had another 20 minutes to dig in on that. Oh, okay. Wouldn't the intrinsic probability of a resurrection be the number of true resurrection claims out of the total number of resurrection claims?
Yeah, so this is I'm so glad you brought that up.
Cool.
Because now I get to nerd out.
I'm here to make you happy.
Yeah, so there's multiple ways, and I'm talking to the audience too, because this is really fun. Sorry, I'm just excited. There's multiple ways to assess prior probabilities. One of the ways that you can do that is by looking at the frequency of the events that you're looking at, right? But that's not the only way, and it might not even be the best way at all times. I have a counter example. I don't want to take up all your time, but I have a counter example and I have an argument kind of against that. A counterexample would be a standard model of particle physics predicts that we would have spontaneous proton decay, but the problem is spontaneous proton decay is in violation of the law of conservation of energy and matter. And so the long story short is scientists have for decades tried to measure spontaneous proton decay, have never, ever witnessed it or observed it or anything, right? But the thing is, the standard model of particle physics predicts it, and we have really good evidence that it does happen. We just never observed it. And so the prior probability, if it's the case that we've never observed spontaneous proton decay in science, the prior probability, if we measured it strictly on like a frequentist metric or a frequency metric, would be really low. So there's some pre-theoretic things.
I'm going to do you a favor.
Yeah.
Trust me, this is me doing you a favor, because nobody here cares about particle physics. I was asking about the intrinsic probability, not the prior. And so like the intrinsic probability of a resurrection, that a resurrection has happened, would be the number of true resurrections or true resurrection accounts divided by the total number of resurrection claims. The intrinsic probability.
Right. So what I'm doing is I'm providing a counterexample to the use of frequency for assessing the intrinsic probability.
Okay.
So, and depending on how we're using the words intrinsic and prior here, I kind of take those to be interchangeable. So maybe you want to.
No, so there's the prior probability of a specific resurrection, but the intrinsic probability of resurrections should be however many resurrections happened out of how many resurrections were claimed. It would be a mistake to say how many resurrections out of how many people died. That would not be the probability of a resurrection.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but that seems to be a conflation between Bayesian statistic inference and a frequentist statistic inference.
Yeah, it's not. This wasn't a Bayesian question. This was about the intrinsic.
So okay, so you're asking a frequentist. Okay.
Yes,
that's great. Yeah, so then I would agree with you. If I'm a frequentist, but I'm not, I would agree with you. But I think there's good reasons to not be a frequentist in this kind of a scenario. Okay. If you want me to give you that.
Remind me when we're done. I have a video to send you that I don't completely understand that you would love.
You guys can make fun of me for liking math a bunch. I'm the Greek guy that's balding and I got glasses. Like,
there's a video out there that I think everybody should probably watch, but it's probably unfair for me to direct you all to it. So go check out my social media at some point and I will post it there. It's called Craig's Calamitous Cock-Up, and it is about William Lane Craig's objections to Bart Ehrman's claims when they got into Bayesian probability. But this goes through and describes the difference between the intrinsic probability and priors, and ends up showing that the math, whether you use long form or short form, works out to be essentially the same. And that makes it so that the probability of any resurrection and the probability of Jesus's resurrection being true.
The resurrection claim collapses under the historical record. Mark, the earliest gospel, was written around 70 CE, decades after Jesus died. Its earliest complete manuscripts stop at Mark 16:8, before anyone sees a risen Jesus. Later books add new appearances, speeches, and locations. Compare Matthew 28, Luke 24, and John 20-21. Changing stories are evidence of developing tradition, not verified history. No documented human has returned after days of biological death. Belief is not proof.
Are fundamentally identical.
On both
Yeah.
estimates?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just really hard disagree with that.
Yep. And
obviously.
maybe we'll go through it sometime. I don't think we're going to get to it
We
here
can do that on our own
I didn't
time.
bring it.
I doubt people want to listen to us go through long-form
This
calculus.
is an obnoxious thing that I want to raise just to hear what your answer is. I'm going to preface this by saying I'm not a mythicist. I think mythicists are overreaching a burden of proof that they can't meet. But I have friends who are mythicists, and some of them are well-read and well-written, and one of them being Richard Carrier. I should say Dr. Richard Carrier, just in case, not that it matters. He wrote a book called Proving History that basically argues for using Bayesian analysis to determine events from history. It's too much. I did not finish reading it. Sorry, Rick. But he then went on to use Bayesian analysis to assess the historicity of Jesus. And I believe that his conclusion was that I think it's roughly an 80% probability that Jesus never existed.
He came to about lower than 0.5, I think is what he argued.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah.
So this is what happens when you don't finish. But his conclusion was that it was at least likely that Jesus never existed. In much the same way that I'm running out of time. So when I did the assessment of Bayesian analysis, and I talked about essentially data running out and the uniqueness of events, if it turns out that resurrection isn't possible and that perhaps Jesus didn't exist, at least in the way that we recorded, does that change anything about the Bayesian analysis that you presented on whether or not the resurrection likely occurred?
Yeah. So can I really quickly
Take all the time
Okay.
because I ran out.
really quickly to speak?
Yeah, regardless
on
of the time, please answer the question.
Really quickly to speak on the Richard Carrier thing. I read Carrier's book and I like it a lot, actually. The one thing is just, I disagree with obviously his inputs. Just like any tool, we can misuse it and come to wrong conclusions, right? Scientists try to prove a flat earth by using science, and you think you and I would agree that they're wrong. So, remind me of your question again.
Here's a thought. Does anybody remember the question? Can you say it word for word? Is your memory good enough? I got it. We can go on. I want to get to your question.
All right.
I think we hit most of my concerns.
All right. So in my opening statements, I kind of pressed a trilemma, which I know a lot of people might not like that type of trilemma because in your experience, you've probably run into like the minimal facts type of argument for the resurrection. And I would agree with you that there's other hypotheses you can put up without the reliability of the New Testament. I put up a trilemma. So with those options, either their claims were true, they were mistaken, or they were lying. Do you think one of those two other theories are more likely than the resurrection?
So I don't, it helps if you actually hold the mic up where people can hear you. I'll try and do this as quickly as I can. Generally speaking, as a skeptic, my position is to put the burden of proof where it should be. And so in much the same way that if you walk into a courtroom, the burden of proof is on demonstrating guilt, but failure to demonstrate guilt doesn't mean that you're innocent. And so when I look at the accounts in the Bible, I am not convinced that they are accurate with respect to what happened, but they may be accurate with respect to what people thought happened. So for example, when somebody tells me they experienced a ghost, I'm happy to believe that they experienced something and that they are perhaps trying to honestly give the best assessment of what it was, but I don't agree with the conclusion that they reached. That's a little problematic, I admit, when it comes to the Gospels, except that I view these as stories and I have no way of determining how likely or truthful they are because there isn't independent confirmation outside of it. And since the evidence suggests that they were relying on each other as well, and there's some question as to whether or not the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain were the same sermon delivered at different times or the same time and things like that. But I'm fine with there was some sermon in some person. I'm not convinced that I have an accurate representation of what the people who reportedly wrote this actually thought, because I don't know what's changed. You mentioned that we don't have anonymous originals, but that's because we don't have originals.
Sure, but on the condition that we know who the Gospels authors were, we would expect to see the type of evidence that we have. So the likelihood ratio favors traditional authorship given the evidence we have versus not. But this is that difference in methodology, right? Yeah. Because I'm a Bayesian, and so I'm pointing out the logically exhaustive options, and I'm saying conditional on the evidence, conditional on the hypotheses we're testing for versus given the evidence, I'm saying that the likelihood ratio favors the resurrection versus those logically exhaustive options. Now, I'm fine, because if you're just not convinced that the Gospels are reliable, I'm fine changing that question to a conditional questions, like if the Gospels are reliable, for instance.
I don't think they're sufficient.
Okay, and then that's going to be a difference in methodology still, right? Because for instance, let's do this. Methodology-wise, logically exhaustive options, the most probable, even if it's just 0.4, for probability, for final probability, but the rest are like 0.2, 0.3, whatever. Isn't that the most rational thing to do, to believe?
No, I'd say the most rational thing, if nothing rises above a 0.5 probability, is to say we don't know what happened. We don't have sufficient evidence.
So we have the logically exhaustive options, and
we have logically exhaustive options, but that doesn't mean that we have sufficient data to determine how those things. Maybe this is what I was talking about with, as the data diminishes, maybe the potential alternate hypotheses, maybe one of them should be a higher probability, but we don't have any way to explore it and investigate it.
yeah, we're just going based off what we do know,
Yeah,
right?
based off what we do know. It's like,
But is that not what we do in science, for instance?
no, because you don't have to reach a conclusion. If you're saying, there's a famous example about Bayesian analysis of if you hear a noise coming from the attic, on hearing the noise, the probability of there gremlins in your attic bowling is low. But on the knowledge that gremlins are bowling in your attic, the probability is high that you would hear that noise. In a similar fashion, if in fact we don't have enough data to be confident that we have adjusted our priors to something that is representative of the totality of experience, then we just don't have enough data to reach a conclusion. And as frustrating as it is, it's not like I'm saying God doesn't exist, God didn't create the universe, Jesus didn't resurrect. I'm saying I don't have sufficient evidence to do that, because what we have are stories and no new data. And the thing that frustrates...
What do you mean by new data?
Christian apologetics tries to turn a normal human response to grief into proof of a miracle, but the data points somewhere else. In a study of 293 widowed people, 46.7% sensed their dead spouse, 14% saw them, and 13.3% heard them. These experiences happened without any resurrection. Paul also placed his own later appearance in the same list in 1 Corinthians 15:8. A sincere vision can create belief. It cannot prove that a corpse defeated death.
I think that's a really important question. Because
Sure.
you mentioned we can't update, like today, we have the testimonies, but we can update because we can put in testimony 1, testimony 2, historical considerations, all that jazz. And then once we run out of the historical data, then I would argue that we can actually do modern day miracle accounts, for instance, to update even today.
But there's no updating, because all of those accounts are from the same sources.
Modern day miracle accounts?
Modern day miracle accounts have no bearing on whether or not Jesus resurrected.
Well, I would push back on that, because, for instance, if you have a miracle account with an associated Christophany, and that Christophany predicts, hey, go reach out to this person, and you're going to be prayed for, and you'll be healed of cerebral palsy, which you've had for 30 plus years. You're paraplegic. You have the brain scans to prove it, all this other stuff. It's biologically impossible to be healed. You get prayed for by that type of that same person. This is a story of Marlene Kleeps, and we can dig into this if you want. Long story short is the religious context of this, because she was healed instantaneously, walked. She scored, I think, 40 points higher in her muscular exams, all this other stuff. She was reviewed by a medical board that, for instance, took care of her for the last, I think it was 20 years. I don't remember everything off the top of my head, but we can look at the notes if you want. And the long story short is Christophany, religious context, prayed in Jesus' name, and she was healed instantaneously, walking, and today she's still healthy as a normal person, no brain defects, nothing. And it seems to me like if we conditionalize and say, if this is a genuine miracle claim done in Jesus' name, if Jesus is alive today, you would expect to see something like that, where if Jesus was dead today, something like that is drastically unexpected. So we can update the priors still even today.
They're independent accounts. I think it's flawed to presume that a miracle done in Jesus' name, even if confirmed, would in any way increase the likelihood that some other miracle account was confirmed. They have to be independent.
Well, yeah, of course, we want to have
because we have no way of knowing that they're connected. There's a presumption they're connected.
I've established the connection sort of here because, like I said,
with similar beliefs.
Well, no, because I'm saying if Jesus rose from the dead and he's still active in the world today, you would expect to see miracles done in Jesus' name with associated Christophanies.
I don't know that we necessarily expect that, but even whether or not Jesus rose from the dead is independent of whether or not there's a God that does miracles.
Right, but I'm just conditionalizing here. I'm using conditional probability. So I'm saying if Jesus is God and he rose from the dead, then I would expect to see this. Much like, for instance, if we have transitional fossils and we want to say, well, what explains this? Well, if some sort of process like evolution was true, I would expect to see transitional fossils.
But the existence of one transitional fossil doesn't tell you about anything at all about the existence of some other transitional form. We could be completely wrong about whales starting as mammals and returning to the sea, and whether or not, and the discovery of Tiktaalik doesn't prove anything about any other thing. What it does is it increases
The probability of a particular model.
of the model.
Yeah.
But you don't have a model, and the model is independent of whether or not Jesus resurrected. I'm talking about whether or not, is it, the question of the debate was, is it a historical fact that Jesus resurrected? How it happened, whether there's a God, it's completely irrelevant. But even if there's a God that if there's a God that performs miracles, even in the name of Jesus, that's completely independent from whether or not that God actually raised Jesus from the dead.
Yeah, that's kind of the whole point of my argument, though, I feel like, right? I'm giving a conditional probability. I'm not assuming God exists. I'm not saying this proves God exists. I'm saying conditional on this hypothesis, I would expect to see these things.
Yeah, but now we're back to assuming there's a God that does miracle, we would expect to see these things. But that's the wrong question. The question is, if we see this on someone recovering, on that evidence, what is the probability that this was done by a God? And what is the probability that that's the same God that also happened to resurrect Jesus?
Yeah, and I would say it's a lot higher given the religious context and given the... Now, so here are the options, at least by my lights, when it comes to
10 seconds.
Miracle accounts like this.
Give him 20.
Here are the options. Either it's some unknown natural law, God did it, some sort of divine intervention, or the report was mistaken. In the case of Marlene Kleeps, I would really discount the mistaken by my medical documentation. And so we're left with those other two options most likely, which is some unknown natural law or divine intervention. If we do some unknown natural law, I think that would actually undermine a lot of the stuff that we know about science, because if there's some unknown natural law that can do something that we've deemed biologically possible, then what do we actually know about the natural laws that we do know today?
Not much, which is why there are all sorts of things that get claimed to be miracles on a regular basis. Remission is claimed to be a miracle from almost everybody who has a theistic view of miracles, and yet the scientific explanation is we don't know.
Yeah, and I'm saying the theistic explanation is...
That's going to be time after his answer. All right. We are going to move into the final portion. And Matt, you can go ahead and do your 5-minute closing.
Oh, I got to find glasses for that. Where are they?
4:59, 4:58.
3 minutes. All right. So one of the things, first of all, thank you all again. This has been great. And thank you, Than. We should go have a lot more conversations.
Heck yeah.
I'm an advocate for trying to have consistent standards when we're evaluating claims. Because if we have inconsistent standards, we're likely to believe things and discount things independent of whether they're actually true. That's how we try and avoid biases. This is the reason why scientific skepticism, or the modern view of skepticism, is very, 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 very much not cynicism. I can't stress that enough. We landed on the moon. There are people who doubt it. I don't think you can know anything to an absolute certainty, but it's way up there. Cynics and conspiracy theorists are the ones who have a flawed epistemology that allow them to inject biases and fears to compound ignorance and say, I don't believe that happened. Skepticism is about saying, I'm not going to believe something happened until there's good evidentiary warrant for it. And it is gaining comfort with being able to say, I don't know. And as uncomfortable as we all are with not knowing, sometimes most times, that's the right answer. Throughout the entirety of human history, the only answer that many people had for most things was, I don't know. And then we developed the processes to go out and explore. The best standards of evidence encourage doubt. They don't discourage doubt and suggest that you'll be blessed for not exercising doubt. Because the truth has nothing to fear from doubt, and the truth has nothing to fear from inquiry. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with saying, I remain unconvinced. We need to do more to convince me.
Religious miracle stories survive by counting rare recoveries and ignoring everyone who prayed and still suffered. A large randomized heart surgery trial found that intercessory prayer gave patients no medical benefit. Those who knew they were receiving prayer had more complications. Medicine also records spontaneous remission without divine intervention, so an unexpected recovery does not prove Jesus did anything. James 5:15 promises that faithful prayer will heal the sick, yet controlled evidence does not support that promise. Calling ignorance God, he claims one universal truth, yet the global map of belief is divided by birthplace. Around 99% of Hindus lived in Asia-Pacific in 2020, while Christianity remained predominant across Europe, the Americas, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Oceania. Research also finds that religious upbringing is a major path to belief. The pattern screams cultural conditioning. A clear message from an all-powerful God should not depend so heavily on where a child is born. That failure exposes the Bible as a product of ancient culture, not timeless moral truth. Acts only says Herod killed James. It never says James could escape by denying the resurrection. The famous story that Peter was crucified upside down first appears in the Acts of Peter, an apocryphal book written generations later. Other apostle stories come from texts written centuries afterward. The church turned late legends into evidence, their purpose. John 20:31 says the stories were written to make readers believe, while Luke 1:1-4 says the author compiled reports passed down by others. That is advocacy built from tradition, with no neutral verification. Sincerity, courage, and confidence can all exist alongside false beliefs. The resurrection argument keeps replacing evidence with certainty, then hiding the gap behind faith. That is how religion shields claims from serious testing. After everything we covered, does the resurrection meet a fair standard of evidence? Comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.